Welcome back to Titanic 100. It's Alex Belfield talking to the people who are going to give us insight today on the history of the Titanic, of course, 100 years ago. We've come now to the Nova Scotia archives, which are just here on University Avenue, and Garry Shutladg joins us. How are you?
I'm not bad. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you. You've more or less dedicated your life of latter years to this, haven't you? And the people who went down with the Titanic and the stuff that has left, the pictures, the writing, the transcripts, everything that's been left since, you more or less know about, and it's mainly within these four walls.
Yes, that is true. Of course, you will find some things down at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. So for anyone coming to Halifax, we don't collect artifacts, so any of the artifacts we had many years ago have been transferred down there now and are on display there.
In terms of what's left, there isn't a lot, is there? I know it's surprising when you start researching this that there aren't many pictures, for example.
No, the fact of the matter is that the city was in deep mourning in 1912, not only because of all of the people who had died, because of the many bodies being brought back to Halifax for burial, but one of the city's favorite sons, George Wright, had also lost his life on the Titanic. He was an extremely popular man in the city, well-liked, well-loved, very philanthropic, and his loss was taken with very hard by the citizens of the city.
And this man was the founder, really, of the integration of classes, wasn't he? He tried to get people living within the same communities of different class.
Yes, he had a very interesting, there was a concept in the late 19th century, early 20th century of what were called mixed-use subdivisions. And George put his money where his mouth was and built a subdivision of upper middle class, and working class people all living in the same subdivision. Obviously the houses were of different proportions for different people. And it seemed to work very well.
He also made the first high-rise buildings as they were in the day. They were only 4 or 5 floors, but even so, they were high by their that day's standards.
Right. He became what today is not necessarily considered a favorite word, a developer. In Halifax, he had built both the Wright Marble Building and the St. Paul Building, which at the time of their building were two of the largest buildings east of Montreal, and they were, as you say, 6- and 7-story buildings.
The impact of the Titanic on Halifax, I think, will go on forever, won't it? Because the story keeps developing. I was just asking you earlier, are there likely to be more photos released? And it does seem like every now and again we do learn something new.
Yes, every once in a while. Like last year, Henry Aldridge had a new photograph of the Mayflower Curling Club, which we had never seen before, which became available. So things do turn up. All of our material will be up online next year, so that people will be able to do all the research they want from the comfort of their own home, and hopefully that will lead to even more discoveries in the future.
Why do you think the history of the Titanic and what happened and the disaster is still so interesting to people? I mean, there are so many disasters of the sea, but this one stuck out so much, didn't it?
Well, I think it's because some of the richest people in the world lost their lives. It was the maiden voyage. It was a ship that was considered practically unsinkable. I mean, I've read somewhere that 10% of the wealth of the United States changed hands when this Titanic sank. That's an enormous change at the time. I mean, John Jacob Astor would be the Gates of his day. I mean, he was a super millionaire. So I think that had an effect. The fact that so many of the first-class passengers gave up their seating so that women and children could be on board the ships was another point. I think that that rang with people as thinking that's the sort of thing I would like to do. The other interesting thing, though, that I'm finding this year, it being the 100th anniversary, or coming up to the 100th anniversary of the disaster, and I suppose anniversary is not a good word, perhaps commemoration is a better word, is how many books are being written on subjects I've not seen before. In the last year, for instance, there are 3 books out on the band. 1 book's on the complete orchestra. Another 2 books are on one member of the orchestra, Jock Hume. I mean, I've been interested in the Titanic for 40 years, but there's never been books on this subject before. Also this year, there's a new book out on one of the engineers who was on board the ship and lost his life, written by a granddaughter. So there are all these wonderful angles. I mean, we're all used to reading about the rich and famous, but now we're getting books about engineers, about members of the crew, I think that makes it quite fascinating, and and making it even more of more interest to contemporary people, because people can identify with the working class. Not everybody can identify with the wealthy.
It's interesting when you talk about the money involved in that ship and the people who were on it. It begs the question, had this have been a ship full of lower class people, would we still be talking about it today? Do you think the answer would be no?
Well, yes, I think we probably would, because, of course, the great majority of the people who died on the Titanic in 1912 were working class and the working poor. I mean, we remember the John Jacob Astors and the Benjamin Guggenheims because they were supremely wealthy. But remember, it was 75% of the, I think it's about 75% of the third-class men and about 75% of the crew all lost their lives. And they were almost all men.
You mentioned earlier about the band, and of course there's Wallace Hartley and the violin. That story is spoken of time and time again. But they never found the violin and they never found the case, is that right?
Well, we have no information in our coroner's material that ever indicates that the violin or the case were recovered with his body. Our descriptions are very good, and if there had been a violin case with a violin in it, with the body, it would have been included on our list, and it isn't.
So what do you think that tells us?
Well, it tells us that perhaps the case was found floating in the water. Someone said, "Oh, I'm going to take this as a souvenir." They opened it up, saw Wallace Hartley's name in it, and subsequently it was merged with the body, but it wasn't at the time that the body was brought back to Halifax. But it does indicate that, to me, that at least that particular violin and case was not with the body when it was recovered.
Do you think there's a lot of anomalies like that that were made right once they'd got back here, and ultimately does it matter?
Probably. Well, I suppose if you're collecting something as an investment, yes. If a violin belongs to someone who doesn't, it's very important. But for the history itself, no. But I think it will always be, people will always talk about these things, and people will, with the Titanic, you always find people talking about the most tiny little aspects of the history of the ship, because this is just the way it is with this particular vessel.
I think when the film The Titanic was released, the intrigue about it and the details and the minutiae of the ship was so important, and still is so important to people. Do you think the interest will ever quell? Do you think people will ever stop writing about it? Because it seems as if there are as many books being written about it today as there were 50 years ago.
I don't think so. I think it. I don't know if you'd call it a cottage industry, but as long as people start writing about their families, and for instance, a few years ago, I think, and maybe even longer than that, Elizabeth Navitrell wrote a book about her uncle and her father who were on board the ship, and they were the 2- and 4-year-old French children. And it's I'm just in the process of reading it now. A lot of it's, of course, fictional, because, of course, but it's a very interesting read. And as long as these people continue to produce books which are readable and enjoyable, and they have Titanic on them, it will always be an industry.
What is interesting about the media today compared to 100 years ago is the fact that when a disaster happens, we get to see everything. We get to see the dead live on TV with rolling news channels. In those days, we didn't have that, and there was a certain decorum, wasn't there? I mean, I was talking to you earlier. I think there was only something like 7 or 8 pictures of people who were dead that are out there. That they really were very protective of what was filmed and what was shown in the press.
Well, the one thing that they made sure is that the coaling wharf, or the flagship wharf, which is where the bodies were brought in for both the Mackie Bennett and the Minia, the newspaper people were allowed on the dock, but nobody was allowed to be there with a camera. No cameramen were allowed. No cameras were allowed. No film was allowed to be taken. There's a story, for instance, of a young American filmer going on top of a hotel to photograph into the dockyard, being caught by the military police. His camera was confiscated and his film was exposed and destroyed because they thought this was inappropriate. As they say, Halifax was a city in deep mourning in 1912. It's fascinating to realize that a lot of the cities, the shops, were all in mourning. very much like when Queen Victoria died in England. The same kind of atmosphere was here, which was not a very happy one in 1912.
Of course, we're looking back 100 years this year and finding out even more as the days go on. For you, is this continually fascinating? I know you're working hard with the website, making sure everything's online for the world to see. Does that give you some form of affirmation, I suppose, of your career, really, that it's going to be out there in the public domain and people will still keep searching it and reading it?
Actually, I've never thought of it that way. I suppose it will. I mean, unfortunately, I don't make there's a difference between me choosing a collection and putting it up online, which of course is my judgment. This is going to be everything we have. So therefore, I have very little to do with other than saying, put it all up.
Give me the website so people can find it.
Our website is www.gov.ns.ca/NSARM.
That couldn't be more complicated, could it? Give me one more time.
www.gov.ns. Oh, I missed something. CA/ and our initials NSARM.
Great. And I'm sure if you just put in Google the Nova Scotia Public Archives, you'll find it that way.
You put in Nova Scotia Archives, Public Archives of Nova Scotia, Google will take you. Google likes our website.
Very good. Thank you so much for talking to me. What an insight from Garry Shutladg, who's dedicated his life to this, really, and it will continue to do so, I'm sure, for many years to come. Thank you for talking to me.
You're most welcome.